Hello, and welcome to the Ignatius Press podcast. My name is Ben Erickson, the manager of this podcast, and today I'm joined by Roy Wenzl. Very good to see you, Roy.
Always good to talk about Father.
Yes, today we're going to be talking about Father Kapaun, or should I say Venerable Kapaun. He was recently declared a Venerable, and you have written a book on him called The Miracle of Father Kapaun. And I'm just wondering, can you just give a brief bio of how who you are and how you became familiar with Father?
Well, he and I have some similarities, although nobody's going to ever nominate me for sainthood. 19 years on the farm, cattle and grain, and really hard, sometimes often dirty work. And then I went off to the university and studied journalism, and I've been a journalist now, professional journalist for half a century, and don't I look it.
Well, we're very grateful that you wrote this book, and I'm personally grateful. I actually read your book when it came out back in 2013, and I was immediately inspired by it. I was just at that point a undergraduate in college, and I read his story, and I was profoundly moved by this work. And of course, you can purchase this work at Ignatius.com. And we wanted to talk about it because Father Kapaun was recently declared a venerable by Pope Francis. And so it's great to have this opportunity to speak with you. Yeah. Now, when writing this book, what sources did you draw on to kind of compile this work?
Well, by the time I entered the story, which was in 2009, writing newspaper stories, Father had been dead for, 60 years, thereabouts. And so the story had been told many times. He wasn't a winner. He wasn't a Medal of Honor hero yet at that time in 2009. We started doing newspaper stories just as kind of like an anniversary story, because newspapers do that once in a while. And he was such a big deal. There's a high school named after him. And then, so I ended up writing a serial narrative, 8 parts over 8 days. And it deeply moved a lot of people. And the main thing I did, the most interesting thing for me, and I think for our readers, is that there were still, at that time, starting in 2009, there were still like 13, maybe 15 POWs from the Korean War who were his friends. A couple of them, he'd saved their lives in the Korean War. And so my project partner, the photographer, Travis Hine, and I flew around the country. We interviewed these guys either on the phone or in person. We did a video at that time, which is also pretty good. And so that was the most moving thing for me, because these were eyewitness accounts of a guy who was, I've referred to him several times as like this Indiana Jones character who does, Indiana, the movie character, does these crazy, death-defying things and is relentlessly brave, but also very obviously a vulnerable person.
Yeah.
And that was Father, except that he did a lot more than Indiana Jones could ever dream of, and saved a lot of lives, and ended up getting, essentially martyring himself, trying to help his fellow prisoners who were dying all around him in the prison camp. It was virtually a death camp. So I interviewed POWs. I interviewed people who'd grown up with him. I interviewed a whole ton of people. So that was the newspaper series. And then about 2014, St. Ignatius contacted us and said, "Hey, there's all this stuff. Could you write a book? Could you weave this together?" And so we did. The Wichita Eagle, my newspaper, and I and Travis put together a book. And it came out, and this is, writers, I suppose, dream of this if they're nonfiction. The book literally came out like 3 or 4 weeks or 8 weeks before the Medal of Honor ceremony, where President Obama handed the Medal of Honor to the Kapaun family, to Ray Kapaun, the main spokesperson for the family. The room was full of senators and generals, and also a bunch of Medal of Honor winners.
Yeah.
When he did that, Travis and I were there in the East Room when this happened. And so you
What an
know,
honor.
yeah, it was pretty cool.
Well, I see. I didn't know that detail. I thought that, that this was all planned because obviously the Medal of
Yeah.
Honor portion is part of the front of the book, and it just, God's plan. I mean, there's a lot of the more you learn about Father's story, the more you see how God, even after he's died, has kind of directed his story. There's a lot of beautiful moments that we'll get to.
Well, I can
But
talk about some of those too, but yeah, I'm not smart enough to organize something like that all comes together.
yeah,
Usually it all falls apart on my
yeah.
charts. But
Well, before we get into Father's life, I wanted to talk about what was it like interviewing the men that he served. I mean, I think that was one of the elements in reading the book that really touched me is, hearing the men's stories that you've, recorded. But what was it like kind of communicating with them face to face?
oh, those are the great moments of my life and career, because these guys had gone through hell, and usually that's a platitude, but they were serious war heroes, in every sense of the word. For one thing, their regiment entered the Korean War right at the beginning, right after the North Korean army invaded the South. So they were sent from Japan immediately. They were almost always outnumbered by a considerable number. The North Koreans were, by our cultural view, were like half crazy, vicious, cruel, ruthless to each other and themselves, because they didn't have our artillery. My POW sources had rifles and were good shots, and they had machine guns backing them up. But the North Koreans didn't have even enough rifles, and neither did the Chinese later, when the Chinese entered the war a few months later. And so the Korean commanders would just say, you go. And when your friends are killed, you pick up a rifle and keep going. So oftentimes these guys in combat were faced with a situation where they were knocking people down right and left, which that's a trauma to the person who does that, as well as, of course, to the guy getting shot. But they all shot. So all of these guys shot probably dozens of people apiece. And their worry in those fights was, are we going to run out of bullets before we run out of North Koreans?
Wow.
And so it was terrifying for them. And they're all kids. They're 20, 19. Some of them were 18. They'd gone through, whatever training you go through at that time. There were a few World War II veterans sprinkled among them who kept things together, but this was crazy. And it happened time and time again. And until finally the American Army and Marine Corps got enough people in there that it wasn't quite that bad. Father in these fights was a hero multiple times over, because GIs would get hit and drop down and they couldn't, hit in the leg or something. So they couldn't, and so the Americans, because of these mass charges, would have to retreat. So they'd leave guys out there unintentionally, but sometimes there were guys 100 yards forward from the American position now, or 150 yards. And here come the North Koreans. And so Father would literally run toward the charging North Koreans under fire, dirt, popping up all around him, sometimes machine gun fire. And he would grab these guys by the belt or the collar, and he would drag them back, still under fire. There was one soldier who I interviewed who was in that battle, in many of those battles, and was also in the prison camp. His name was Joe Ramirez. He said that man was crazy. I saw him do it. He was crazy. This endeared him, obviously, to these guys. And so he became, his great leadership was in part because they saw him do this. So he wasn't some officer with soft hands who had an academic background of any kind. He was that guy. He was that guy, doing those things.
Like you said, he was significantly older than a lot of the guys. Like, I think that's something that's easily overlooked. I mean, most of the men, like you said, were like 19, early 20s, and Father was in his, mid 30s at this point.
34.
34. And, they did see him as a father figure that, not just because he was a priest, but because of his actions, like you said. And I think that was the part when I look at the story and the events that unfolded is how he led by example. He ministered by being one of the men, and then as also being a priest. And I think that really struck me with how to really evangelize and how to minister to people.
Well, he did things I described, but he would also, when there wasn't bullets kicking at the dirt, he was that guy. They would be marching like 10 miles in one direction, and he's with them on foot, and he would veer off into the countryside and come back into the line 2-3 hours later with his pockets and maybe a bag full of something, potatoes, corn on the cob, hard corn, apples, anything he could find. And then he would go around. I don't think he ate any of it himself. He would go around. He would get in some kid's foxhole and say, "Hey, here's a nibble."
Yeah.
And then the other thing you have to do when you're in the army like that and out in the field is you don't want to just go anywhere. So they would have to dig latrine holes. Mm-hmm. And so he would show up when they're digging latrine holes at the end of some day, and he would be like in a T-shirt. Sometimes he wouldn't even wear the helmet with the chaplain insignia on it. So at first they didn't really know who he was. So there's this guy showing up with a shovel saying, "Hey, let me help you." And they would help dig one latrine, move over, help somebody dig another. And he did this all the time, things like that. He would write letters home, dictated by some wounded kid. Did that regularly. There were people who said, I don't think that guy ever slept, because I'd peek my head out the tent at 3 a.m. and there he is, doing something, coming back from, grabbing some more food out in the countryside. And he's talking to people. And so he was the classic leader by example.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was in all those daily acts that he really won the men over. And I think that was that evident when you talked to the men, even 50 years later, when you talked to them. I can only imagine what respect they had and love for. I mean, it's evident that they continued to push for his cause for sainthood, but and their desire to give him the Medal of Honor. Many of them were the reasons that this happened, is because they kept pushing for these honors that he received.
Yeah. William Funchess, who's now not with us anymore, he told me, "We've never understood why the church has dragged this out so long, because we knew in the field that he was a saint before we were captured. And then after, we knew. So this whole business of, years and years and he's still not there, that doesn't make any sense Funchess was a Protestant, but, and I think all the Catholics were gone from this world by the time I got into this, but these Protestant guys, they said the Catholics were baffled by this too. They thought he should have gotten promoted to sainthood shortly after the war in the 50s.
Yeah. Well, I want to get into a lot of the granular, some of these stories as well, but I wanted to address one of the elephants in the room is simply the pronunciation of his name. For those who are, familiar with the story, they have a couple different pronunciations. So what in your eyes is the correct pronunciation? And is there a story behind the different pronunciations of his name?
Yeah. And it's silly, but fascinating. And I love it. And I have, you're already in trouble, Ben, for pronouncing it Kapaun.
Okay.
Which is the correct pronunciation, except for those who pronounce it Kapaun. So the Kapaun side, if they're watching this, they're not going to be very happy with you. And they might even tell you about that.
Okay.
And so with the other side, if we say his Cape, so the correct pronunciation for me is father.
Okay.
But
so what's
here's
the story
what happened
behind that?
Well, at first I didn't understand it, Ben, and I just thought it was just utterly baffling. I mean, how could you, this guy's a Medal of Honor winner and very obviously a potential saint. So what's the fundamental rule about a newspaper story, even if it's 2 inches long? Get the name right, get it spelled right, say it right. Don't mess it up, because then everybody thinks you're a fool. But I heard it both ways repeatedly. And at first I didn't pay attention. And then I realized people got really mad at each other, depending on which side of the pronunciation they were on. And it was baffling. The there's a POW still very much alive. One of his closest friends, his name is Mike Dow. He's from the Houston area. I talked to him a week ago. He's pushing 98, still works half time. He's a nuclear physicist. And the first time I contacted him in '09, he was one of the first that I found and talked to. He got mad at me on the phone. It's not Kapaun, because Kapaun High School is all you hear up here in Wichita. And oh, really? Yeah, don't do it again. And he's a pretty blunt-spoken guy, and we were not close friends then. And so I slipped up a couple of times, and that was not a mortal sin according to the Catholic Church, but oh boy, you don't want to piss off a guy who's killed a lot of people in his life. So I was baffled, and it took a while, and I finally figured out what the deal was. He called himself Kapaun for the first 30-some years of his life, all the way through childhood, altar boy, early years as a priest. He goes to the World War II. I think he was still calling himself Kapaun then, but then comes back, and he is the priest of his hometown church. And if you've ever been part of a small town, tightly knit community, you know that everybody's in your business. And so he had a little bit of trouble, and he tried to be very nice about it. But people in his own hometown didn't treat him right, some of them, in the church. And they would, I interviewed people who knew what happened with this. They were really old people, delightful and wonderful. Some of them still have Czech accents because the whole community, most of it was Czech. And they said, well, people got upset, and they would say things like, I knew this kid when he was in a cradle, when his mom would hold him in her arm and during Mass. And now I have to go to confess my sins. It was deeply troubling. And so there was this air of things. And so he wouldn't use these words, but he finally got a little disappointed to the point where he asked the bishop, can you please move me somewhere else? Fresh horizons. And eventually the bishop sent him to another tiny little Czech community in Kansas called Timken. And I don't know this for a fact, but after that, he started calling him Kapaun. And I think the reason was, all his life, except for World War II, a couple of years, he's been in this tiny little town. They don't even have a public restroom in that town, by the way. It's that small.
Wow.
And he's out on the farm and so on. And I think he decided that a fresh start meant, maybe a little bit of a fresh identity. And so when he went to Japan and then Korea, he was calling himself Kapaun, and that's why every single POW, most of them are not with us anymore, but every POW I interviewed called him Kapaun. And there were other soldiers I interviewed who were in combat but did not end up in the prison camp, and they called him Kapaun. And they all said, because I was asking, they all said, yeah, he called himself Kapaun. And so you have this odd little thing that I think is just precious. It's just,
yeah. I was surprised when I was doing this research that there was two different pronunciations. I mean, there's quite a difference between the two, but I always heard Kapaun until I was doing some of this research, and I specifically with the people in Kansas, they would call him, Father Kapaun, and so it is funny that there is this little disagreement. Well, in doing some of my research, I was kind of, he's most famous for his acts in the Korean War. And, as we were communicating, you kind of pointed out that his early life is somewhat uneventful, but I do want to cover a little bit of it just because if people aren't, very familiar, but he was born in Kansas to his mother and father. How many siblings did he have?
Just one. His brother, Gene,
Okay.
I think was the older. Gene actually fought in combat in World War II as a soldier.
Okay.
And so his mom and dad, I forget, I'll get this wrong. One of them was mostly Czech. One of them was mostly German.
Okay.
And it's a mostly Czech community. So they were a devout Catholic family, but unremarkable. It was a small farm. Because I'm a farm kid, I know that work was often difficult. A lot of what you do is problem solving.
Yeah.
And when you start out trying to solve problems, it's like, oh my, I don't know how to do this.
Mm-hmm.
So part of the reason he was a hero in the prison camp is because he had all these incredibly practical little things that he'd learned, fixing fences, fixing pieces of machinery, keeping things running when he's the only guy in the field and he doesn't want to pull his father off of a tractor and interrupt his work.
Yeah.
So, unremarkable. But from the beginning, he wanted to be a priest. I mean, his earlier books written about him say that he would, his mom told people that he would take boxes and turn a box into an altar, and he would figure out how to make vestments for himself and then set the table, so to speak.
Wow.
And would, practice holding mass and that sort of a thing. But it was mostly unremarkable.
He also
Nobody would have
served.
known him if it hadn't been for the last year of his life.
Yeah. He also served in World War II, correct?
Yes,
In,
as a
in
chaplain.
as a chaplain. Is there anything
Yeah.
remarkable about his service in World War II?
Not that I know of, except that all service in war is honorable. And so he's on the other side of the world, India, Southeast Asia, running around in a Jeep. The guy was a workaholic, so he probably didn't sleep there either. So he, went around, heard confessions with soldiers, did masses for them, and probably, no doubt, worked relentlessly. But there's never been any indication that, that he was ever under artillery or sniper fire or machine gun fire.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I will say, so when I read this book initially, there's a couple stories that stuck out to me, but it is remarkable that he served in World War II and then, went also and served in the Korean War, which is obviously where the majority of his story is known. And I remember one of the little stories that's in your book was when the men kind of were like, well, why did you didn't have to come? You volunteered, to come to Korea. Why did you do that after serving in World War II? And he made a remark, have you ever gone to one of the Ladies Society meetings, And that made me chuckle the first time I read that. So it's good. He
Yeah,
had quite a sense of humor.
that was Bob Wood, the POW, who's no longer with us, but he was like, you came back? You came back are you crazy? And this is in the prison camp. They're talking, why would you do that? And that's what he said. You think this is tough? You ever had to work with a altar society in a Catholic church? Well, I think that kind of reflects why he didn't quite feel that he was a match for his own hometown church back in the day.
Mm. Yeah. So after World War II, he also, the other reason I, have a personal connection to him is he attended the Catholic University of America, and that's where I'm currently doing my graduate studies. And actually, I wouldn't say that was one of the reasons I went to Catholic University of America, but I remember when I was applying, I thought back on him and I said, I'd love to attend the university that he attended. And he got a degree there in that time. But again, it seems like there's a couple pictures of him, but it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot noteworthy in that time aside from he got higher education,
Not that I've found, and I confess that I didn't pay a lot of attention to that because I file cabinets at the Wichita Diocese about him are many and full and jammed with information, but almost there's very little that reflects his time at the university, except that knowing him, he probably got straight A's and helped students and, dug into his own pocket if he ran into a student that needed money. That was him.
No, he from everything that I've read, he seemed to be a very good student, knew multiple languages, but it wasn't one that I would say was like known for his academic prowess. Like he's not a Thomas Aquinas kind of figure, but he was brilliant. And I think that honestly, the reason I wanted to talk about kind of his early life and, his vocation, story about him, wanting to be a priest from a kid and stuff like that it is uneventful. And I think that's something Father Kapaun is a very relatable saint. A lot of times when you read the stories of the saints, you can't relate to them as much, or at least I can't. And I think Father was one that as soon as I read his story, I could relate to him as a person, like he was very human. He was very ordinary in many ways, but he allowed God's grace to be manifest through him and to the men around him in that time of distress. And all those uneventful things that could be easily overlooked is what prepared him for that last year of his life.
Well, yeah. And as one example from back in his childhood, several people I interviewed who grew up with him said he was just really smart. And so and really unassuming and humble. So he wasn't a talker in class. He kept talk to a minimum, but he would get done with his work way before everybody else in the class if they were doing classroom work. And then he would look around and then see somebody was struggling with math or, some language, English language, uh, uh, assignment. And he would very quietly just scooch over, say, "Hey, I'm done. How can I help?"
Mm.
And then he would help, sometimes multiple students in one classroom for that day for one subject. And it didn't matter if it was math, science, education, or I'm sorry, English. And that's him. So he was doing that as a kid.
Well, it's amazing that same heart where he's looking for the one person who needs help, he did that on the battlefield and he did that in the schoolyard then, like
Yeah.
helping the people that were kind of overlooked. And well, I want to get into, I mean, obviously the last year of his life, which is the most notable in many ways for his acts of heroism. How did he get captured? There's this, you talked about how, there was all of these waves of Chinese and North Koreans that would come, and then he was captured. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
The Chinese had done was they decided to enter the war in part because and they kept warning us through side doors, don't come near the Yalu River or else. And MacArthur would brush these intelligence reports off. Anyway, so they massed, I think it was 500,000 troops along the border. And then they started marching them into North Korea at night. So obviously you don't have satellite views. And so they managed to along with MacArthur's, exploring this idea that this is happening, they managed to get hundreds of thousands of troops across the river. And the 8th Cavalry is just south. It's just 20 miles, maybe closer to the Yalu. And they have no idea. And so the 8th Regiment set up tents in a valley, which if you're under threat, you don't want to camp in a valley. And flat valley with hills all around. And so they had no idea that there were as many as 20,000 Chinese troops in those hills, locking and loading and getting ready, ramping up emotionally. And they charged. And the Americans had no idea. All of a sudden, there's bugles screaming, machine gun bullets flying around. There were probably, the Chinese had 20,000. The 8th had far less than that. Several battalions, not necessarily close to each other. And probably, I don't know, maybe I forget the number, but it wasn't much farther north or south of 1,000 guys.
Wow.
And again, they had machine guns, they had grenades. About a third of the Chinese soldiers had nothing except their officers saying, "We will shoot you if you don't run forward." And so it's just a massacre, both sides. The American soldiers told me they were knocking Chinese soldiers down right and left with rifle fire. They pretty soon they were going, "How many bullets have I got left on my person? How many grenades have I got left?" And Father is running around the battlefield from the first shots, racing around, dragging people to safety after they've been hit, giving absolution, and encouraging people. And one of the soldiers told me, it was a private named Bob McGreevy, said he gathered a little group early on of soldiers around him, just very briefly, and said, "Look, this is bad. A lot of you aren't going to survive the day. I'm here for you. Let's say a little prayer." And then he did, and they broke up the group and went on. And the high point for him, I think this went on for like 2 days. So those who weren't killed, there were, at one point, he and this heroic doctor, and I'm sorry, I don't remember his name. It's in the book. He and this heroic doctor in the unit managed to collect a bunch of, as many as 40 wounded Americans into this dugout where they were had some cover from bullets and shell fire and grenades. And the Chinese are, yards away. And so here's one of the high points of the whole story. He's in there trying to help these soldiers after he drug them in as best he could, the doctor and others. And the Chinese had this habit of shooting the wounded. They shot their own wounded. And I think because of my farm background, you got this calf that's not going to make it through the day, gasping, help it along. So it wasn't necessarily malicious, vicious, murderous, whatever. Well, there might have been some of that because they didn't like us very much, especially after they watched these guys mow down their compatriots. Yeah. But so there's like 40 or so wounded, father and the doctor in this dugout trying to shelter, and the Chinese, he knows, are going to come in and start just blasting away in this dugout and start shooting the wounded. And so they do. They come in, guns blasting, and he literally runs up to them and goes like this, "Stop, just stop." And he's not armed. They're pointing rifles at him. Yeah. They didn't like us very much, and they didn't know necessarily. I don't think they knew he was a chaplain. He was just, wearing an army uniform. Mm-hmm. And there was a Chinese officer that somebody had dragged in among the wounded, and that guy spoke enough English that Father used him to tell them, lower your weapons. These guys are not a threat to you. Please don't just murder us. There's no reason you should do that. We're surrendering. You got us. Yeah. And so they decided to agree to this. So right there, he saved 40 lives. Yeah. Maybe. Yeah.
And it's right then, after that too, that one of the soldiers was wounded, right? And then there's the famous story of how he saved his life.
So Herb Miller wasn't in the dugout. He was this tough sergeant who had gone through D-Day and a couple of other huge battles in World War II. And he's this real short, tough sergeant. So he was older than the other guys by a few years and had a lot of experience in combat. And he told me, because he was one of the guys we talked to, he told me he warned, even before the bugles and the shooting started, he just had this feeling, and he talked to some Koreans passing by who pointed at the hills and said, many gestures that said lots and lots and lots of something. And they're worried, and they're pointing at him, and they're pointing at the camp. And so he'd gone to officers who assured him that everything's fine. Go get some rest because we'll march tomorrow toward the Yalu. So he said, I listened to this. He used that word that would be regarded as a venial sin. And he went over and loaded every pocket he had with grenades because he knew what was coming. And so he's running around shooting people for a long time and for 2 days trying to keep alive, and got blown up with a grenade. And so in 2009, when I interviewed him, I said, really? Trust but verify, Herb Miller was his name. Trust but verify, Herb. Show me that your ankle was damaged. So he yanks up his pant leg in the kitchen, and it looked awful. I mean, the ankle was like bone, like this all around the ankle. There's shrapnel wounds that are blue and red all the way up his calf. And you can tell that he walked with a little bit of a limp, but the ankle looked horrible. Mm-hmm. So he can't walk. He's immobilized. The Chinese are yards away. And so he yanks a dead Chinese soldier on top of him and plays dead. Mm-hmm. Before he did that, he would lie there, and as the Chinese would get closer, blow him up with a grenade. Mm-hmm. Finally, this one is on top of him, and he's playing dead under this dead guy. And the soldier yanks the dead guy off of him and puts the muzzle of his rifle on Herb's forehead. And at that moment, he heard somebody call out, "Stop," or words to that effect. Herb heard this, and the Chinese is like hesitating. And this guy walks up. Well, what happened was Father had surrendered his wounded and surrendered himself. So they're walking out of the opening of this dugout. And as soon as he walks out, Father sees this execution in progress. So he yells and trots over 20 yards or so. He literally brushes the Chinese soldier's rifle in the air with an arm, doesn't even look at the guy, bends down and says, "Hey, let me help you up." And he could see that the ankle was just bloody as can be. So he pulls him on his back and walks away with the Chinese guy pointing at him the whole time. And he'd also run away from the guards at the opening of the dugout. They could have shot it. He was running. They would have been justified in their view to just pop him in the back and drop him right there. So he just puts him on his back and carries him over to the other wounded. And now he's one of the other wounded. And so on they go.
Yeah. And then they go on this really long march, that, there's so much in the book that we can't cover, but I think the part that really was inspiring to me was, here he is in this, freezing temperature carrying these men, but he's also encouraging the other soldiers to carry the wounded and to help them along. And when the soldiers wouldn't listen to their officers who commanded them, he would kind of come up to them and through his strength of character, encourage them to not leave the wounded behind. Because of course, if the wounded were, dropped, they were dead, So,
well, here's where their love for him came into play. You can imagine what these kids are like. 19, 20, they haven't eaten in 2 days. Chinese didn't give them any food for days while they're marching 40 some miles or 50 miles to this village that became their prison. It's not freezing yet. It's early November, okay. So it's cold, but they don't have sweaters and any winter stuff because MacArthur had decided we're going to be home by Christmas eating turkey. And they're exhausted. They'd shot dozens of guys apiece. That's incredibly traumatic, no matter what the movies portray.
Yeah.
So they're in shock. They're in shell shock. They've been shot at for 2 days with machine guns and rifles. And so they're done emotionally. They've had it. And so their officers, the Chinese start shooting the wounded on the march. If you can't keep up, Chinese would stay behind. He wouldn't wave them as they walked away, but he would stay behind. And then 5 minutes later, you hear this pop in the back of the line. This happened several times. And then the soldiers are so exhausted, they had no litters. Yeah. They weren't strong enough at that point to carry some other guy 150, 60 pounds on their backs. They couldn't do that. So they started ignoring officers' orders. Officers were running up and down the line frantic. Please, please, don't leave him behind. You can hear the gunshots. You know what's going to, this guy's dead if you don't help us. So they were stringing together, I don't know, pieces of twine or sticks or anything they could get their hands on to make these makeshift carrying things for 4 guys for 1 wounded. And that's exhausting. Even, you 4 guys carry somebody for 100 yards. You are panting. Yeah. So, they just started ignoring the officers. A lot of these guys, they'd rest at a crossroads and then Chinese would go, all right, let's go. And they would just start walking away and the officers are pleading with them, please don't, come on, help. But when Father would show up, it's like, come on, help me. He wouldn't say, get up, help me. He would pick up his part of a soldier to carry. He'd say, hey, who's going to help me? Come on. This won't take long. We're just going to go another 100 yards and sit down and rest for a moment. Come on, guys. And they were so embarrassed. It was shame at that point. They didn't want to walk away from that guy who they had seen repeatedly run forward and drag people to safety. Yeah. And so guys I talked to, there's also testimonials from guys who were dead by the time I got into the story who all said the same thing, that people would pick up the soldiers as best they could. Mm-hmm. Not all, but his example was something. And again, we'll get to this later, but it was calculated what he had done preceding all of this.
I think if you ever want an example of what a leader is, I think you need look no further than Father. Like this is what a leader looks like, leading by example, leading not just with his words, but just doing the thing that nobody wants to do, and then encouraging others to do the same. And that example, that heroic virtue, is contagious in some ways. Like it is shame, but I think there is an element of inspiration as well. I don't
Right.
know. What do you think?
Now, my story was about him, but I have no doubt that there were officers and sergeants like Herb Miller who did lead by example
Mm-hmm.
and who got the same results. So I
Mm-hmm.
don't want to make any veteran officer from any of the subsequent wars to think, well, what does Roy Wenzl know about officers in the Army? So anyway,
Well, can you talk about once they got there, what the prison life was like? Again, we can't go into all the details, but I mean, I was struck by how dire that situation was and what the men had to go through once they got there, and then how Father ministered in the midst of that horror.
it was the worst hell anybody could imagine, this side of hell. It really was. For example, they did start feeding them at times on the march, but not very much. And it was awful and supremely unhealthy. But they fed their own soldiers the same crap. It was literally birdseed, unground. Now, I'm a farm kid. You don't just dump Milo or corn or soybeans into a feed bunk to feed cows. You got to grind it first because otherwise it's hard seeds. It's like tiny stones, like grains of gravel. It's an indigestible. Um, so I don't know what the Chinese soldiers did, but they were fed the same thing. And let's see, here's my hand.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, you see that?
Mm-hmm.
That's how much they got for one day. Birdseed, the POWs. And so if you're starving, you got this grain seed. You can, if you have time and inclination, and that's important, you can find a way to pound rocks and maybe soften it up. You can put it in water. They didn't give them water.
Yeah, a lot of them
Um,
were just eating the snow once it got cold enough because they didn't have
right.
that water.
Well, in the camp, yeah, and that killed a lot of people. But
Yeah.
so you're hungry. You haven't eaten in 3 days. You finally get this much birdseed.
Mm-hmm.
What do?
Yeah.
Especially if you're a 20-year-old kid and kind of a lunkhead like most 20-year-old kids
Yeah.
are. And it wouldn't be digested and it'll also just do a number on their stomach lining and their intestines. And they're not getting hardly any nutrients out of it. So they quickly began to diminish, father included.
Yeah. Well, and then they talked, some of the details, once they got to the prison camp, it's obviously bitter cold. Like they talked about some temperatures reaching -30. They weren't allowed to have fires most of the time. They, couldn't pray. They were at least not supposed to. Father frequently disobeyed that order. Little
Yeah.
food. I mean, some of the stories about, just to give people a context for how bad it was, like people would get so sick of being in the prison camp, they would just commit suicide by rolling away from their brothers at night because that's how they kept warm, and then they would just freeze to death. And it's just these awful conditions. People would die because of the lice. That you taught. You mentioned all this in the book. So, and in the midst of this, Father ministered to them. Can you talk a little bit about how he ministered to them in the midst of this? Like you said, hell. I mean, there is no other way to describe it.
Well, he ministered to them and mostly by example, but he also led prayers. And so let me just describe what he faced for the last 4 or 5 months of his life. So there are no outhouses. It's a village. There might have been outhouses, but at first there's I think 1,300 people behind some very light barbed wire that you could step over because they're in North Korea. And if you step over the wire, where are you going to go?
Yeah.
Your army buddies are a long way from you. So it would snow. It's muddy when it's wet, but then it gets really cold and there's snow and there's no place to go for nature's call. And so they were leaving themselves in the same snow that they were using to hydrate. They didn't give them water in this first winter. So they were scraping snow with their fingernails. And if that snow is hard, if you're a kid, you remember what that was like to try to make snowballs.
Yeah.
So they're scraped. And so people started dying right and left of dysentery and other really horrible, painful stomach ailments. So they're dying right and left. I mean, some of these guys told me that they had no place to pull the bodies when it's freezing cold. They were later drag them to sandbars in the nearby Yalu River and, scratch a hole. But at first, there's no place. And so you would have bodies literally stacked up beside the little village huts like firewood, like big piles of firewood, frozen, rock solid. And so, and then lice multiplied. These guys are spooning. They have no jackets.
Mm-hmm.
They're spooning each other at night. I don't think they had blankets at first, and it's 30 below. And there's probably drafty huts. And so they're spooning, lying, cheek to jowl,
Mm-hmm.
feet to head, any way they could keep warm. It was awful. And so people are dying right and left. And so they're kids. And some of the soldiers told me that city kids didn't do nearly as well as the farm kids. There were a lot more farm kids in America then. Farm kids were used to physical labor and physical punishment and working 12 hours a day, sweating like awful and working in the cold. And they're under relentless pressure from the Chinese guards. They wouldn't let them light fires.
Mm-hmm.
So father would sneak out under the barbed wire and scrounge for potatoes and bring stuff like that back. But he would also have have a bag with him, and he would stuff it with whatever food he could find in some bombed out cellar. He would also bring back corn stalks, because this is late in the year, 1950. And that burns. It's really dry and brittle, so you could start a fire with some corn stalks. And then the other thing that he did, and I'll get to his actual praying and ministry shortly. But when I first got into this story and these guys are telling me he saved hundreds of us, I was like, okay. I would be very polite about it, but it's like, Mark Twain used to call some versions of stories fish tales. So at first I was professionally skeptical, but I now believe he saved hundreds. And here's why. One thing that he did, besides saving all the guys that he did on the battlefield, besides the 40 or so that he and that doctor saved in that bunker, is that the village had been bombed. It's a North Korean village. It had been bombed by our Air Force, by the American Air Force at some point. So there's shredded roofing tin all over this village. And he had no tools, but he would take this stuff and use stones that he picked up, and he would pound into the shape of a bowl, and then light an unauthorized fire that would get him in real big trouble with guards if they saw it or smelled it. And he would boil snow until it was boiling water, and then it's safe to drink.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one guy making one bowl, but then he started teaching other guys how to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And tin, I used to work with roofing tin, including shards of it. That stuff, I don't know how he cut it, because you have to cut that to make a bowl. How did he do that? I have no idea.
Yeah.
But the soldiers, all of them told me he would take pieces of roofing tin and just mold it with his fingers and pound until he had a bowl that would not leak. I think that's impossible for most people to do that. But that's
even just
where
lighting a fire that you can't smell or see, and then getting water to the point that it boils without, I mean, you talk about the roofing tin, but I mean, doing that without getting caught consistently.
Well, yeah, and it wasn't quite like Stalag 7 from the old German World War II movies where, you've got guards and they've got binoculars. The guards knew that these guys weren't going anywhere, probably. So there was really light wire along the perimeters. They couldn't go anywhere. Plus they're starving now. How far are they going to walk? Yeah. It's like, I forget how many hundreds of miles back to the Allied lines in what is now South Korea. Where are they going to go? So it wasn't necessarily impossible to light a fire and get away with it. And so they boiled a lot of water. They did. And he would just talk to them incessantly. Hey, let me show you this. hey, help me out here. Can you scrape up some snow? Because I'm going to boil some water and it's going to taste like coffee in the finest restaurant. So he's continually upbeat. In fact, he would, yell, start hollering in the morning. They didn't have reveille bugles, obviously, but, first thing a lot of these guys heard before sunrise was, hey, everybody, come get your coffee. I got hot coffee here. It was boiled water. It was
Yeah.
boiled water. So here's what else he did, though. He prayed with guys. And here's something that ought to resonate with people who are Americans who are so divided against each other today. He would have none of that if he were with us today. He wouldn't yell at people, but he didn't play that way, and he didn't want anybody else playing that way. And so his saying of the rosary, he would include everybody, including Jews and Protestants, and it became a form of the resistance. And that too was calculated because these guys were on the verge of emotional collapse. The guards, the propaganda people in the camp wanted to beat them down emotionally, so they would cave in and start making voice recordings denouncing the United States and the United Nations effort.
Yeah.
And when you're emotionally shot and you don't think you're going to live past next week, whatever, why not? If they promise me just a little extra food,
Yeah, it's worth it.
he would resist that. He would holler at the guards. He wouldn't holler at the soldiers. But the prayers, the rosaries, which he said probably every night, sometimes during the day, in huts where they couldn't see him because the guards didn't want any of that stuff going on. It became not only a prayer to the deity, it became an emotional support that kept guys alive, which is another reason why the soldiers all said, all of the Protestants, by the time I got to them, that kept them alive. Not just because they're praying to the deity, but because the guards didn't want them to pray. And so it's like, okay, we'll see about that. We're going to go off to the hut where I know Father is. Mm-hmm. And I don't know that there were biblical readings, except that Funchess had managed to secrete one of those tiny little green Gideon Bibles that I saw when I was a kid.
Yeah.
He'd stuck it on his person somewhere, had it in the camp. And so he would open it up and read the 23rd Psalm or some other Psalm or some other reading in this gorgeous South Carolina Southern accent, dripping with syrup. And so they would have these little gatherings, and it kept guys alive, and it also rallied them to be soldiers. The Chinese were trying to create automatons who had given up emotionally and would do whatever they wanted with recordings or written testimony denouncing the United States. Mm-hmm. And it became a form of resistance. And then, see, he was in the officer camp with the officers. They separated officers from the many more enlisted men. He would crawl across the barbed wire at night, sneak into the enlisted men's camp and do the same thing. So Herb Miller, the guy with the destroyed ankle, was in the enlisted side. And so was Bob McGreevy, who was in that little prayer circle at the Battle of Unsan. And they remembered, they told me chapter and verse, he would come across almost every night and sneak in and say, hey. And it wouldn't be like, we will now pray to the Lord.
Yeah.
And it wasn't, have you been saved today? It was, hey, look what I've got. And he would have this like half-damaged rosary. You want to say a little prayer with me?
Yeah.
Except that he would precede this. He was such a calculated, sweet, smart leader. He would precede this. He wouldn't just come in and lead off with the rosary. He would come in and he had some pipe that he'd scrounged from somewhere. He smoked tobacco when he could in a pipe. And he had fashioned some terrible concoction to smoke in the pipe that would produce smoke. It wouldn't produce the nicotine pleasure. But hey, was anybody want to smoke a little pipe with me? And so he would light this thing, pass it around, and when it ran out, he clean it out, fill it again, and they would pass this pipe around, tell little stories, and then he would end up by saying, hey, you know what? You want to say a little prayer with me? Yeah. I'd like that. Would you like that?
Yeah.
So it's very upbeat, framed as a question, by the
Yeah.
way,
Yes.
not as this kind of thing. It was calculated, and it kept them alive, these guys.
I think that was something when I was reading a story that hit me back when I was, an undergrad, and when just in preparing for this interview, reading it again, is it's really a model, not just of leadership, but how to evangelize. It started with him developing that relationship with them through acts of service, not being pompous or saying I'm a chaplain, but not having the chaplain uniform, and just going and serving with the guys. And then all of a sudden engaging with them on a very human level, and then inviting them to prayer, not telling them they need to pray, not telling them they're going to hell if they don't pray, just saying, hey, why don't you pray with me? And I think that he is an example, not just of leadership, but how, Christians and Catholics can evangelize other people and encourage other people toward holiness without being pompous or without being in your face. It's a very authentic way of engaging with other people.
This now leads me to bring up the most amazing thing I ever figured out about him. So when I was finishing the series in late in 09, the worst thing you can feel as a writer when you're trying to write a really compelling story with a very compelling overall theme, you got to have an ending that really just blows people away. Bang. Oh man, I wasn't expecting that, but it all makes sense. Wow. And I didn't have that. I'd worked on this thing for, I don't know, half a year, 9 months, something. And I didn't have an ending. And I'm, what the heck am I going to do? And it's like an actor who would bomb a major Hollywood movie. Same feeling. Yeah. Like, I am so going to mess this up if I don't figure this out. So far, I've got some really great stories to tell, but I don't have an ending, which is the most important part of a great story. And so I put off reading his sermons until the very last. So before we're in, I think, 1940, there's this sermon from Palm Sunday, 1940, I think it was. Might have it slightly wrong. So we're not in World War II yet. He's a kid in his 20s. So 1940 to 1950 is 10 years. So if he's 34, so he's like 23, 24 when he writes these sermons that I found in the files. And I'm going to, I have the book, so I'm going to read you just a few sentences.
Yes, please.
So here's one. Men find it easy to follow one who has endeared himself to them. Does that ring any bells about when I said it's calculated?
Yeah.
He's 23, he's 24. Okay. And then a man finds it a pleasure to serve one who has saved his life. 1941, and he's already figured out what to do, not only in the coming war, World War II, but in a war that won't happen for another 9 years. He has figured out what he's going to do, where he all of a sudden explodes into Superman. He's a kid. He's spent his entire life in this, except for a couple of years elsewhere, becoming a priest in the seminary and then at American University. Holy moly. He's planned the whole thing while he's still a kid. He's never been very far outside of Pilsen. Wow. And so that was very much part of him, that he figured out what he was going to do to minister to people when the world fell apart, when it's a dystopia land, and it very much was in Korea in 1950 and 51.
It strikes me about those quotes too, and you make a point of this in the book, how much Father imitated Christ, and I think those words that you just showed, certainly, like you said, it's calculated in the sense that he tried to do that for his own men. But I think in many ways, you could use those same words for Christ, that he, Christ gave his life for us. And then Father Kapaun found it easy to follow Christ because, God gave his life for us. And so many of those same passages I kind of see it two ways. Like, he's the person leading, but in many ways he's also the one following. And that's how he was such a good imitation of Christ. And I think the imitation is really evident in his death. So can you just, briefly talk about how did he die? Like, how did his story And at least in some ways, because, much of the book then, like this is only a third of the way through the book, is, everything that happened after his death. But can you just briefly talk about his death?
When he died, it was horrible. And Mike Dow was there along with Funchess and a couple of other guys I talked to. So he finally had run out of gas and gave his food away to encourage people to stop stealing from each other when they were starving. So he's done physically. Can't stand up anymore. He's lying and the soldiers were protecting him, and he was actually recovering. They were sneaking a little extra food to him. Mm-hmm. And the guards saw this as a chance to get rid of this guy who had stood up to their brainwashers and said, "You guys are full of crap." Mm-hmm. And he would say that word. So they saw a chance to get rid of him. So they didn't line him up and shoot him. But they finally decided we're going to take him away up the hill to this thing that the POWs called the death house, where they would just lie him on this horrible dirt floor with poop on it and leave him there with the flies and whatever else, and no water. He's already starving. So, Father lasted about a day and a half up there. But when the guards came, Funchess and Dow and the others gathered around, and they're shoving the guards who've got rifles, and Dow can barely stand up because he's so starved. And they're shoving the guards around and yelling, and Father is speaking up from the floor saying, "Stop, stop, 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 stop. Don't. Just let me go. I'll go. Don't put yourself out like this." And so the guards they brought some litter, a real litter, and they're going to haul him away. But Bob Wood and some of the other soldiers in there go, "No, we'll take him." So it's like a final honor guard.
Yeah.
With these starving, staggering, barely can stand up POWs carrying him up this hill. So it's a steep climb to this hill and into the death house where he died. And on the way, Father starts doing this as he's passing the Chinese guards. He's blessing them. And these guys are essentially part of the conspiracy to end him.
Yeah.
And he's doing this anyway.
Yeah. Repeats Christ's words, "Father, forgive them, they don't know not what they do." So he's even in that moment echoing Christ's final words, and I think one of the things, there's a lot of his last words. I don't want to spoil all of it because I think everybody should go out and purchase this book. But, you have this beautiful image of him forgiving the people that are literally killing him at this point and have killed many of his friends, and so there's this beautiful, very saintly moment where you see grace working through him. But then the human element is still there, because one of his other last words is one of his buddies. I'm sorry, I read it this morning. I forgot his name already, but one of his buddies had a troubled marriage. And Father said, if you don't fix your marriage, I'll come down and I'll kick you in the rear end. And he used more colorful language. And I think, that's something, if you read the book, Father did, he was very human. He definitely had a temper a little bit. He definitely used some words that, would make some people blush. He never used God's name in vain, which I think is very notable, but he definitely used colorful language, and something he didn't like about himself, but something that, made him much like the men that he served. But I think that that's something that really resonated with me. Again, here he is doing something very beautiful, but and saintly, right? And clearly he, is a saintly person, but also he's still human. He's still relatable, even in his final moments.
Yeah, he would use swear words and then tell people later, "I shouldn't have done that.
Yeah,
don't listen to me when I do that. I shouldn't have done that."
It makes him really relatable. Again, it's not language that and we should encourage, but I think that there's a realness to him that makes his sanctity even more pertinent in some ways, because it's like, okay, here's if he can be this historic example and still be human, he's an example for the rest of us, to call ourselves to that holiness and to call other men to. He was also had quite a sense of humor too. One of the stories that struck me this morning when a Chinese officer was saying, you shouldn't pray for your daily bread to come from God, but from Mao, because that's who gives it to you. And Father's reply was, if this is, an example of God's daily bread, then God must be a terrible baker. And the Chinese officer just didn't know how to respond to that, And it's that humor, that humanness that I think combined with Father's example and holiness that just really strikes you. He really is a saint for the modern times and for modern men, I think, in particular. So, there's so much more we could talk about, but I want to end with just a couple of questions for you. If you studied Father for a long time, and you've met with a lot of the people that knew him personally, if you had to describe him to people, how would you describe him? Like in a word, or is there a story? Like what would be kind of the person of Father?
Good company.
Hmm.
Yes, he deserves to be a saint. But the other thing that all these people told me was he was just the best guy to have beside you, to watch a sunrise or to talk about family. He was really engaging, and I think that was just a little bit calculated too, although that seems like he's always playing chess with you, but he wasn't. He was just, people would tell me he would show up in bars in Timken, I think it was, the second place that he was a priest, and just sit there smiling and listening to people talk around him, pulling on a pipe, maybe having a water, maybe a coffee. And if you can't, so he didn't go around, preaching. Half the time when he did that, I wouldn't be surprised if he wasn't even wearing a collar. But he was just good company. Just this guy, that no matter what your religion or your political beliefs, he would be the most enjoyable person you could sit beside. And then there was this, and he wouldn't ever mention anything. Had he survived the war, he would never have mentioned anything about what he did in the war. And Dow and the others all told me that they knew what we were conspiring to do, because they did. Those POWs got him the Medal of Honor that he deserved. He would have told us to drop it, and that he was thoroughly embarrassed and ashamed, and that he didn't do it for that.
Yeah.
He's just excellent company, and without even hardly saying a word about it.
Well, I think, he's received the Medal of Honor. He's been made venerable now, and God willing, he'll be declared a saint someday. And I think that in his story, and you kind of touched on this earlier, he is in many ways an example of not only a saint, but also of an American, and you talked about the divided times, like there's a couple stories, he encouraged people to pray with him, but he also encouraged them, to sing American songs, to rally their spirits and to be a patriot. And I think that was very touchy for me too, is he embodies many of the ideals of Catholicism, of course, but then also of being an American. So I don't know if you could talk about that as we kind of close out here.
Well, yeah, he was thoroughly American. He despised the Chinese. He didn't despise the Chinese. He despised what the brainwashers were trying to do.
Communism.
And they were very coercive about it. So this business of swear words and denouncing them to their faces might have got him killed, because Bob Wood told me one of the things that happened was he had instilled a resistance and a spine into these starving guys. And so they weren't putting up with the brainwashing or the sermons that came with it. They were mocking, because he was mocking. So patriotism was very much interwoven with the prayers, with the rosary, with everything else.
Yeah. Well, and then that you talked about it a couple of times, that he was ministering not just to the Catholics, but to the Protestants, to the Jewish people, to the Muslims, to the point that they all loved him just as much as the Catholics did. And so that he didn't compromise the faith, but he encouraged this union of different religions in a search for the good and virtue, and drew out the best in people.
Yeah, he did. It was all intertwined. It was all done so very subtly, and done by this guy who was just a pleasure to be around, even if you were both starving to death. So, yeah.
I'm really, really grateful to spend this time with you. I mean, it's honestly been a great honor to talk to you, because this book really inspired me, and I never thought that one day I would be able to talk to the author, who's obviously talked to all these great, men that served with Father. And so I highly encourage everybody to purchase this book, The Miracle of Father Kapaun, priest, soldier, and Korean War hero. So I highly suggest everybody get this. Honestly, reading this book brought me to tears this morning, just kind of reviewing this for the this episode. And honestly, it brought me to tears when I first read it. So, we have only scratched the surface of the story. There's so many more details that you provide, so many more stories. So I highly suggest everybody. We haven't even gotten to some of the more, talking about finding his body again. There's a great movie that you've helped produce talking about that. So I'll link that in the description below too, along with this book. So there's so many more details about Father's life that are worth investigating that sadly we don't have the time to talk about today. But Roy, thank you so much for joining us. It's really been a great pleasure.
Do you have time for just one short 2-minute story?
Yes. Well, I would love a closing story, please.
Okay. I forget when this was. 6-7 years ago. So I'm coming home to Wichita from North Kansas, where I grew up. Mm-hmm. And my mom is in the car with me. And so we're going past Pilsen because that's on the way. So I remembered halfway through the journey that, hey, it's Father Kapaun Day or Father Kapaun. It's Father Day in Pilsen. So I divert, and my mom is kind of, what are you doing? She's in her early 80s, and she's like, what are you doing? She didn't like change of plans. It's Father Day. You're going to meet some of his friends and followers. Mm-hmm. Okay, fine. Well, it's a church, Mom. She's a devout Catholic. We show up, and Ray Kapaun, as he pronounced it, Ray is there, the nephew. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden, I had this little thought. Oh, I'm going to have some fun. So I lean over. Ray is sitting on my right. My mom is on my left. And I whisper to Ray, do me a favor. And I tell him what it is. And grins and says, yes. Comes back and he's got this thing under his arm. And he goes like this, like, okay. So I take it from him without Mom looking. And I said, hey, Mom, step over here for just a moment. Okay. What? She's crabby. What? Doesn't like change of plans. So I put her up where there's nice light coming through the basement windows against this wall. And I hand this thing to her, turned backwards so she doesn't. I said, don't look. My wife had a camera. And so I nodded to Cheryl, my wife, and she took the picture. And I made prints for everybody in the family of this.
Oh,
that is the Medal of Honor, which still resides in that house next to the church. And you can see she's kind of smiling because I was really trying to get the frown off. So she's smiling. I sent this to all my brothers and my family, and I had a big blow up for her. Oh, she was testy with me. And I said, you know what? After what we put her through, no mother in this life deserves Medal of Honor in her hands more than this woman. Mm. And so to this day, the blown up version is sticking up in some of my brother's houses and mine. And so it's been a joy, Father. I am so grateful to you. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I'm really grateful you shared that story. One of the things that really strikes me about Father's story is how much he means to the people in Kansas. One of the moments that I choked up watching your movie was watching his body return and watching the streets lined with American flags and people praying and people joyful that he's finally home. And, just your story shows how much he means to that state. And really, I hope his story becomes more well known because I do think he does represent the best of America and of Catholics in America. And so, yeah, I'm really glad you shared that.
Okay. Thank you.